Claire Whitaker felt the cold steel of the handcuffs bite into her wrists as the sheriff shoved her into the back of a patrol car. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched the massive steel jaws of a blackwood harvester bite into the first 1,000-year-old cedar of her family's grove. She screamed until her throat was raw, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of machinery. Beside her, on the seat, lay the document that had just destroyed her life. A deathbed decree from her own father, declaring her mentally incompetent and stripping her of her birthright. As the car pulled away, Claire caught a glimpse of her brother Elias standing on the porch, clutching a heavy leather briefcase and wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just hours ago, Claire had been the sole protector of this land. But now she was being hauled off to a psychiatric ward, while the world she bled for was sold for scrap. She looked down at the muddy floorboard of the cruiser and saw a single, blood-stained page from a hidden ledger. A page that proved the protections her father built were actually a front for something far more sinister. How did a fight for an inheritance turn into a trap designed to erase her existence? And why, as the first tree hit the forest floor, did her brother whisper a name that wasn't hers? The gate groaned like a dying animal, its rusted hinges screaming as Claire Whitaker threw her weight against the iron bars. Sweat slicked her palms, making the metal slippery, and the hem of her blouse clung to the small of her back. She gritted her teeth, muscles burning, but the damn thing refused to budge more than an inch. The investigator, some wiry man in a cheap suit, leaned against the other side, his shoulder pressing into the gap. "You're trespassing," Claire snapped, her voice raw. "This is private property." He didn't flinch. "Ma'am, I just need 5 minutes of your time." 5 minutes. As if 5 minutes could unravel the last decade. She exhaled through her nose, the air thick with the scent of dry grass and motor oil from the old tractor rusting near the fence. The heat pressed down like a palm, suffocating and relentless. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dirt that felt like a permanent mark of the land she was failing to protect. The investigator's eyes were narrow, professional, and entirely devoid of empathy. He looked at the estate not as a home, but as a carcass to be picked clean by his employers. Claire felt the vibration of the metal gate as he shoved back, a rhythmic thud, thud, thud that echoed the frantic beating of her heart. Every inch he gained felt like a personal violation. A car engine rumbled in the distance, growing louder with a predatory intent. Claire didn't turn. She knew that sound, the low, aggressive growl of Elias's BMW, a machine that cost more than the yearly yield of the North Orchard. The tires crunched over gravel, kicking up a plume of dust that coated the dying weeds in a layer of gray ash. The car skidded to a stop just beyond the gate, the door slamming with the finality of a gavel. "Claire." Elias's voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes locked on the investigator. The man straightened, his posture shifting from casual persistence to an alert, subservient stance. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, nodding. Elias stepped forward, his polished shoes immaculate despite the dust. He looked like he belonged in a high-rise office, not standing on the porch of a collapsing legacy. He adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture of control that made Claire's jaw ache. "You're on my land," Elias said, though he wasn't looking at the investigator. He was looking at Claire, his pale blue eyes cold and calculating. The investigator didn't back down. "I'm here about your father's will." Claire's stomach twisted into a knot of cold lead. The gate creaked between them, a barrier that suddenly felt flimsy as paper against the weight of the legal machinery Elias carried in his leather briefcase. Elias's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence was an answer, a confirmation of the betrayal she had sensed since the funeral. "I'm not moving, Elias," Claire said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And neither is this gate." Elias reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. The white of the parchment was blinding in the Oregon sun. "It's over, Claire. The court has reached a decision." He stepped closer, the smell of cedar and expensive cologne clashing with the scent of pine and rot. "This is a legal eviction notice. You have until sundown to clear your things." The heat seemed to spike, the air shimmering over the dry fields. Claire felt a bead of sweat trickle down her spine. The eviction notice wasn't just a piece of paper. It was an erasure of the last 20 years. She thought of the grove, the ancient trees that had seen their grandfather's grandfather. Elias was handing her a death warrant for the land. "You can't do this," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "The debt. I'm documenting the dumping. Blackwood is using the South Ridge as a landfill. If I prove the environmental crimes, the sale is void." Elias laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You and your dirt samples. You're playing at being a scientist while the bank is taking the walls from around you. This land is a liability, Claire. It's a sinkhole for Whitaker money that doesn't exist anymore." He climbed the porch steps, his shoes clicking on the weathered wood. Claire moved to block him, her arms spread wide. She felt the heat radiating from the house, the old timber groaning in the sun. "Get off the porch, Elias. I mean it." "Make me," he challenged, his voice dangerously quiet. Claire didn't hesitate. She threw her weight into him, her hands slamming against the fine wool of his suit. It was a desperate, clumsy shove, born of a decade of resentment. For a second, Elias stumbled, his eyes widening in genuine shock. He hadn't expected her to fight, not like this, not with her hands. But the victory was short-lived. The security guard, a hulking man who had been standing silently by the BMW, moved with a speed that belied his size. He was on the porch in 2 strides. He didn't use his hands. He used his shoulder, a calculated professional strike that caught Claire in the chest. The world tilted. The blue sky spun, replaced by the brown, parched earth of the yard. Claire hit the dirt hard. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, leaving her gasping, the taste of copper and dust filling her mouth. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears of rage, and saw them looking down at her. Elias looked disgusted. The guard looked bored. But as the guard reached down to help Elias straighten his jacket, his heavy leather briefcase slid toward the edge of the porch. It was a momentary lapse in focus. Claire's fingers, calloused and stained with the soil of the estate, lashed out. She grabbed the handle, pulling it toward her as she scrambled backward. "Hey!" the guard shouted, reaching for his belt. Claire didn't wait. She rolled, ignoring the scrape of gravel against her skin, and bolted for the front door. Her boots thundered on the porch steps. She slammed into the house, the heavy oak door swinging shut just as the guard's hand hit the wood. She threw the deadbolt, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. The interior of the house was dim and smelled of stale pipe tobacco and old paper. It was a tomb, but for now, it was her fortress. "Claire, is that you?" A shadow detached itself from the hallway. Julian stumbled forward, his eyes bloodshot and his hair a silver-streaked mess. He was holding their father's old double-barrel shotgun, the metal glinting in the sliver of light from the transom window. He smelled of cheap bourbon and unwashed clothes, his hands shaking so violently the barrels rattled against the doorframe. "Elias is outside," Claire panted, clutching the briefcase to her chest. "He's got a guard. They're trying to force us out." Julian blinked, his face a mask of drunken confusion. The gate. I thought I heard the gate. Is Dad back? Dad's dead, Julian. Focus. Claire moved past him into the study, the heart of the house where the Ledgers lived. She slumped into the leather chair, the one with the cracked seat, and stared at the briefcase. It was locked with a digital keypad and 2 heavy latches. Outside, the shouting began. Elias was screaming her name, his voice muffled by the thick timber of the walls. The guard was thudding against the door, a rhythmic, bone-deep vibration. I need a tool, Claire muttered. She looked around the desk, her eyes landing on a heavy iron letter opener shaped like an eagle. A gift from a senator their father had once bought. She jammed the tip into the seam of the briefcase and heaved. The plastic groaned, resisting, until with a sharp crack, the lock shattered. She spilled the contents onto the desk. There were maps, GPS coordinates for the Grove, and a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened it, her eyes scanning the columns of figures. It wasn't just debt. It was a roadmap of corruption. Names she recognized, Judge Blackwood, Sheriff Reynolds, were listed alongside dates and dollar amounts. Oh, God, she whispered. The ledger didn't just show the Whitaker debt. It showed the environmental protections her father had touted for years were nothing more than a legal shell. The land wasn't being saved. It was being laundered. The trees weren't a legacy. They were a curtain. And according to the most recent entries, the soil was legally categorized as toxic waste, a designation that made it worthless to any buyer except Blackwood Logging, who had the permits to remediate it by clear-cutting every single acre. Claire felt the world crumbling. The man she had spent her life trying to honor was a fraud. The land she loved was a crime scene. She looked at Julian, who was leaning against the doorframe, watching her with a vacant, hollow stare. You knew, she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The money for your rehab trips, the checks that kept coming even when the timber prices fell. You knew what he was doing. Julian didn't look away. He just tightened his grip on the shotgun and took a long, slow pull from a silver flask. It doesn't matter, Claire. The land's already dead. We're just the ghosts haunting it. The ultimatum came through the door an hour later, delivered not by Elias, but by the low, gravelly voice of Sheriff Reynolds. Claire, I know you're in there. Elias says you've got property that doesn't belong to you. You've got 6 hours. 6 hours to pack a bag and hand over that briefcase, or I'm coming in with a warrant for theft and a mental health hold. Don't make me do this, girl. Think about your reputation. Claire sat in the flickering light of the study, the old scanner humming as it struggled to digitize the ledger pages. The machine was a relic, the glass scratched, but it was her only hope. Every time the light bar passed over the ink, she felt like she was capturing a piece of a monster. 6 hours, she muttered to the empty room. She tried the desk phone, hoping to reach a lawyer in the city, someone who wasn't in Blackwood's pocket. The line was dead, not just silent, but physically severed. She looked out the window and saw the thin black wire dangling from the side of the house like a slaughtered snake. Elias was thorough. He was cutting her off, piece by piece. Cooper? She called out, looking for her dog. The wiry mutt usually slept at her feet, a constant grounding presence. She whistled, a sharp, two-tone sound that usually brought him skidding across the linoleum. Silence. She moved to the kitchen window. The woods were deep, the shadows stretching long as the sun began its slow descent. The dog had been barking at the tree line minutes ago, a frantic, territorial warning. Now, there was nothing. Not a cricket, not a bird. Just the heavy, oppressive heat and the feeling of eyes watching from the brush. "Julian, where's the dog?" Her brother didn't answer. He was passed out on the kitchen table, an empty bottle of Jim Beam cradled in his arm like a child. Claire felt a surge of loathing so sharp it frightened her. She was alone. Truly, utterly alone. She slipped out the side window of the pantry, her boots hitting the damp earth with a soft thud. She knew the perimeter better than any of Elias's guards. She stayed low, moving through the overgrown hydrangea bushes, her heart hammering against her ribs. She needed the neighbors. The Callahans, the Ruizes, people who had farmed this valley for generations. Surely they wouldn't stand by and watch the Whitaker Grove be turned into a corporate dumping ground. She reached the Callahan farm as the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. Old Man Callahan was on his porch, a pipe in his hand. But as soon as he saw Claire stumbling across his field, he stood up and retreated inside. "Mr. Callahan," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Please, I have proof. Blackwood is bribing the officials. They're going to destroy the whole valley." The door clicked shut. The deadbolt slid home. Through the window, she saw Maria Ruiz pull her curtains tight. It was a wall of silence, built from the bricks of fear. They knew. They all knew what Blackwood was capable of. They had seen the accidents at the mill, the disappearances of those who spoke too loud. Claire stood in the middle of the dirt road, the dust swirling around her ankles. The community she thought she was fighting for had already surrendered. A flash of orange light caught her eye from the direction of the Whitaker estate. She turned, her breath hitching. A plume of thick, oily smoke was rising from the south end of the property. The timber barn. The structure was over 100 years old, filled with the history of her family, and the remaining physical files her father hadn't managed to burn. She ran. Her lungs burned, the air tasting of ash and diesel. By the time she reached the barn, the base of the structure was engulfed in flames. 3 men in dark clothes and tactical masks stood by the doors, one of them holding a canister of accelerant. "No!" Claire screamed. She didn't think about the odds. She grabbed a high-pressure industrial hose connected to the well pump, her fingers fumbling with a heavy brass nozzle. She twisted it open, and the water kicked back with a force that nearly dislocated her shoulder. She aimed the stream directly at the lead man's face, the water hitting him with the force of a punch. He went down, coughing and cursing. The other 2 lunged for her, but Claire swung a heavy iron shovel she'd snatched from the garden shed. She wasn't a fighter, but she was protecting her soul. The shovel connected with a masked man's ribs with a sickening thud. They retreated, surprised by the ferocity of the woman they'd been told was a fragile academic. They vanished into the smoke, the sound of a retreating truck echoing through the trees. Claire turned the hose on the flames, her eyes stinging, her skin blistering from the heat. She fought the fire until her arms turned to lead, until the last glow was extinguished, leaving only the charred, skeletal remains of the barn's foundation. She leaned against the wet, blackened wood, gasping for air. Then she saw it. Her car, parked 50 yards away, was a twisted hunk of melting plastic and steel. They hadn't just burned the barn, they had cut her legs out from under her. She walked back to the house, a ghost in a scorched blouse. Julian was standing on the porch, finally awake, watching the smoke with a detached, glassy expression. "They burned it," Claire said, her voice a hollow rasp. "Where were you?" Julian looked at his boots. "Elias called. He said if I stayed out of it, there'd be another 10,000 in the account by morning. I need that money, Claire. I can't. The sheikhs. I can't do it without the money." Claire looked at her brother and realized she didn't recognize him. He wasn't a victim of their father's legacy. He was a willing participant in its rot. "Get out," she said. "Claire, get out before I use the shovel on you," she screamed. She watched him stumble down the driveway, a broken man walking toward a broken future. She was the last Whitaker left on the land, and the chainsaws were starting to roar in the distance. The sound was a low, rhythmic throb that vibrated in Claire's teeth. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of progress. Blackwood style. The bulldozers were moving on the grove. It was barely dawn. The 6 hours were up. Claire was back in the study, her eyes red-rimmed and burning. She had been through the ledger 5 times, her fingers tracing the lines of corruption until she found it. A single page tucked into a hidden sleeve in the back cover. A codicil. It was a legal amendment, signed by her grandfather, stating that the Whitaker estate, specifically the old growth grove, was a living trust that could not be sold, logged, or altered without a unanimous vote from all living heirs. Elias didn't have a unanimous vote. He didn't have her. A heavy thud shook the front door. "Open up, Claire. We have a warrant." Sheriff Reynolds' voice was booming, backed by the sound of a battering ram hitting the oak. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed the ledger, stuffed it into a waterproof satchel, and headed for the basement. There was a cellar door that led to the old root cellar, which in turn opened into a drainage ditch behind the house. She crawled through the damp, spider-webbed dark, the smell of earth and rot filling her nose. She emerged into the gray light of morning just as the front door gave way with a splintering crash. She didn't look back. She ran for the grove. The machines were already there. 2 massive yellow bulldozers and a crew of men with chainsaws. The foreman, a man with a face like a hatchet, was shouting orders. "Start with the big one. We need a clearing for the trucks." Claire burst from the tree line, her chest heaving. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She walked directly into the path of the lead bulldozer and sat down in the mud. The machine ground to a halt, the blade inches from her knees. The foreman jumped down, his face purple with rage. "Get the hell out of the way, lady. We've got a job to do." "This land is a trust," Claire shouted over the roar of the engines. "I have the codicil. You're trespassing." The foreman grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin like talons. He tried to drag her toward the tree line, but Claire fought back, using the heavy satchel as a shield. They tumbled into the mud, a desperate, undignified scuffle beneath the shadow of the ancient trees. "The judge signed the order," the foreman hissed, pinning her wrists. "You're nothing. You're a crazy woman squatting on corporate property," he signaled the driver. The bulldozer roared, the black smoke belching into the pristine air. The blade lifted. "Wait!" Claire screamed. A massive oak, its trunk wider than a car, began to groan. The chainsaws had already done their work on the far side. The tree tilted, a slow, majestic fall that seemed to take hours. Claire threw herself into a shallow ravine, the mud swallowing her whole. The world exploded in a thundering crash as the oak hit the ground, the vibration tossing her like a rag doll. Branches shattered like glass, raining down on the spot where she had been standing seconds before. The foreman retreated, shielding his eyes from the dust. Claire lay in the mud, her heart hammering, her ears ringing with the sound of the forest dying. "That's enough." The voice was calm, measured, and utterly terrifying. Elias was standing at the edge of the grove, flanked by Sheriff Reynolds and 2 deputies. He looked down at Claire in the ravine, his expression one of pitying contempt. "You always were the dramatic one, Claire. But it's over." He held up a document. It was notarized, stamped with the seal of the county court. "This is a declaration of mental incompetence," Elias said, "signed by Dad 3 days before he died. He knew you'd try something like this. He knew you weren't stable enough to handle the burden of the land." Claire stared at him, the mud slicking her hair, her hands shaking. He wouldn't. He loved this place. "He loved the money more," Elias said. "And as your legal guardian, I've waived your voting rights. The sale is final. The logging continues." Sheriff Reynolds stepped forward, the handcuffs glinting in the morning light. "Come on, Claire. Don't make this harder. We've got a bed waiting for you at the county hospital. A nice, quiet room where you can't hurt yourself." Claire felt the cold steel snap around her wrists. She didn't fight. She couldn't. The betrayal was absolute. Her father, the man she had worshipped, had preemptively erased her. She was dragged through the mud, past the fallen oak, and shoved into the back of the patrol car. As the engine started, she looked through the window and saw the foreman nod to the bulldozer driver. The blades moved forward. The forest began to scream. The patrol car smelled of stale coffee and the deputy's cheap aftershave. He was a young man, a kid really, who kept glancing at Claire in the rearview mirror with a mixture of guilt and nerves. He wasn't from the valley. He didn't know the back roads, the way the mud turned to grease after a morning mist. Claire sat in the back, her mind a cold, sharp instrument. She wasn't defeated. She was focused. "You know," she said, her voice low and steady, "the old logging trail through the ravine is a shortcut to the highway. If you take the main road, you're going to hit the Blackwood convoy. You'll be stuck for hours." The deputy hesitated. He checked his watch. "The sheriff said to get you to the ward by 9. Take the ravine trail," she urged. "It's solid ground. My father built it himself." It was a lie. The ravine trail was a death trap for anything heavier than a mountain goat. The deputy turned the wheel, the SUV bouncing onto the narrow, rutted path. He accelerated, trying to make up time. Claire watched the trees blur past. She waited until they reached the steepest grade, where the mud was deepest. "Now!" she shouted. She leaned forward and kicked the gear shift with both feet. The car lurched, the tires spinning wildly as the transmission screamed. The SUV swerved, the back end sliding toward the edge of the ravine. The deputy fought the wheel, but the mud had already claimed the tires. The car slid sideways, a slow-motion descent into the brush, until it wedged itself between two stout saplings at a 45-degree angle. The deputy was dazed, his head snapping back against the headrest. Claire didn't waste a second. She reached through the gap in the partition, a gap the deputy had forgotten to lock, and snagged the keys from the ignition. She unlocked the cuffs, her fingers trembling, and slipped out the door. The air was cool, the woods thick and welcoming. She didn't run away. She ran deeper into the estate. She used her surveyor's memory to navigate the backwoods, avoiding the main trails where the deputies would be searching. She reached a hidden equipment shed near the north boundary, a place Elias didn't even know existed. Inside, tucked beneath a false floor, was her emergency kit. A waterproof satchel, a handheld GPS, and the digital backups of the ledger she'd hidden days ago. She didn't have a car, but she knew the schedule of the timber trucks. She reached the main road just as a Blackwood rig was slowing for the turn. She swung onto the flatbed, burying herself beneath a heavy tarp as the truck roared toward the county seat. She reached the courthouse at 10 a.m. She was covered in mud, her blouse torn, her eyes wild. She looked like a madwoman, which was exactly what Elias wanted. She burst into courtroom 4B just as Judge Blackwood, the man whose name was all over the bribery ledger, was preparing to sign the final transfer of the Whitaker estate. "Stop!" Claire shouted. The room went silent. Elias stood up, his face pale. "Sheriff, get her out of here." "I have the evidence," Claire screamed, slamming the satchel onto the clerk's desk. "I have the digital backups, and I have the shell company records." She pointed a mud-stained finger at the judge. "The Blackwood Corporation isn't a logging company. It's a shell. And the majority shareholder is HB Holdings. Harold Blackwood, you." The judge's face went from white to a sickly, mottled purple. "This is a courtroom, Miss Whitaker, not a theater. You are under a mental health hold. Read the ledger." Claire challenged the court stenographer. "Look at the entries for June 14th. A $50,000 consultation fee paid from the Whitaker estate account directly to HB Holdings." The room erupted. The reporters in the back, the ones who had come for a simple land dispute, were suddenly on their feet, cameras flashing. "And I'm not the only witness," Claire said, her voice dropping. The back doors opened. Julian walked in. He was sober, or at least sober enough to stand straight. He was carrying a stack of bank statements, his face set in a grim, determined mask. "He's right," Julian said, his voice echoing in the hallowed space. "I took the money. I took the hush money from Elias and the judge to keep my mouth shut about the dumping. But I'm done. My sister, she's the only one who ever gave a damn about the truth." The judge tried to gavel the room to order, but it was too late. Two state investigators, who had been tipped off by Claire's digital uploads hours earlier, stepped forward from the gallery. "Judge Blackwood," the lead investigator said, his voice cold. "We're going to need to see those ledgers and your personal financial records." The collapse of the conspiracy was swift and brutal. Within an hour, the sale was frozen. Within 2, the judge and Elias were being led out in handcuffs, their faces hidden from the cameras. Claire stood on the courthouse steps, the sun finally breaking through the Oregon clouds. She felt light, as if a weight she'd been carrying since she was 12 had finally been lifted. She returned to the estate that evening. The logging machinery was gone, left idle in the mud. The grove was scarred, the fallen oak a reminder of what had almost been lost. But the rest of the trees still stood, silent, ancient, and safe. She walked to the center of the grove and touched the bark of the oldest fir. The land didn't belong to her father anymore. It didn't belong to Blackwood. It belonged to itself. She took a deep breath, the scent of pine and damp earth filling her lungs. She was the steward now. And for the first time in her life, the Whitaker name meant exactly what it was supposed to. Protection. The end.